Welcome to the Manglegrove. It is, as you can see, a rainforest. I like rainforests both in real life and in video games, so let's talk about this. Let's go ahead and discuss some of the techniques you might use and some of the techniques they used. First thing we're going to have to make clear, Dragon Quest XI has a lot of constraints. Since it's supposed to be something that 10-year-olds can play, they couldn't really make it into a dense rainforest where you would be pushing through shoulder-high foliage the whole time like this. Instead, what they've done is they've had to go with these broad, straight paths that really rob it of any sort of sense of being a nice, dense jungle. And instead, it feels more like a hiker's path. They didn't really have a choice. That's a game constraint. I can understand that. If they had to do it, they did it pretty well. This texture here is wonderful. It's a wonderful way to give us a flat piece of ground in a wetland forest. This is how wetland forests on the west coast actually look. They have a combination of clover and moss and lichen with grass coming out. And it is a wonderful texture. It literally looks exactly like this. So they sold it, even though it doesn't really make it feel very rainforesty. It's still enough to keep you in the correct sort of mindset. So good on them for that. Another constraint they had is their lighting engine. At least I presume this is the constraint they were fighting against. In the shadows, we have a serious problem with things looking like undifferentiated blobs, and our character doesn't feel like he's actually here because he doesn't have any shadow coming off of him or anything. I believe that this is the reason they decided to get rid of the canopy. And instead, you're constantly walking in and out of shadow so that you can constantly get reacquainted with how the forest looks in the sunlight. Even in the moonlight, the differentiation is much better in actual straight-up moonlight rather than the shadows of night. So I think that's why they decided to get rid of the canopy, but that's a darn shame because canopies are wonderful. If you are making a game like this, consider using a lighting engine that doesn't make some of these sacrifices. For example, every modern game engine that does 3D can do adaptive brightness, so that basically your camera will adjust like the human eye does. And if you walk into shadow, then the shadows will become much more diverse and you'll be able to see them better. In this case, that's something they didn't have available to them, so they apparently decided to not use as many shadows as would actually be in a rainforest, which is fine. They couldn't use any practicals. Everywhere else where there's been shadows, there's been torches. You can't really fill a rainforest with torches, so I can understand why they did this. With that in mind, there's a lot of green, and this is a little bit of an issue. Now, green doesn't have as much of an effect on the human brain as, gray, brown, dusty colors like we have in the city. You're never going to look at a pile of green and think, oh man, more green. Ugh. No, it's never going to give you that bad feeling, but you still have to navigate this world, and that means using a lot of different kinds of green. And you notice that most of these plants have a lot of different shades of green to them, especially when compared to other plants. They've got some darker greens, they've got some light greens, they've got some yellow greens and some blue greens. They got some greens that shade out differently towards the tip of the plant. This wide variety of greens means that you can always see where you're going and what is at the edge. You never feel like it's just an undifferentiated blob of green, unless you're stuck in the shadows, where it's much harder to tell. I recommend you do the same thing. Keep in mind, however, that different kinds of plants will give different kinds of light responses, so it's worth making sure that plants feel differentiated when the sunlight hits them, as well as just in their base texture color. And that has a lot to do with how thick the leaves are. You can fake it, nobody cares. Just make sure that they never feel too blobby. You don't want an undifferentiated blob of green. You want every single plant to feel a little bit distinct, so that when you walk through them, you get a sense of that they're there. And they do a pretty good job of that. So that's really well done, and that's also my advice for you. Make sure you have a lot of different kinds of green. Still, you're going to want things besides green, and that's where, rocks and tree trunks come into play. This breaks up the green quite a bit. If you are doing paths, then the path itself will break up the green quite a bit, and you want to do very much other work in terms of making sure the player doesn't feel lost in green. But if you're like this, for example, and you're trying to break up the green of this sort of situation, it's good to have either plants that are much noticeably different, for example, bamboo, or to break it up with things like tree trunks and rocks. Now, the tree trunks and rocks are a little bit of a challenge because they need to be covered in green. These, I don't buy them. They're not covered in green, but the larger trees definitely are, and the rocks are. And that's because in a rainforest, everything grows on everything, and you're going to have green everywhere you look. It's just a matter of breaking that green up with enough of another color, whether that's brown or gray or blue or whatever. Here you can see a good example. This tree, there's enough of a gray-brown that you don't think of it as green when you compare it to the rest of the game. But of course it is covered in green, and if you had this tree somewhere else, it would feel like the green element in that particular area. This is also a great example of how to make a vine. It's just a bark-colored rope wrapped around the tree with a whole bunch of broad leaves just clustered together. Now, these folks actually modeled all of the threads that go out to the individual leaves, like you can see there. You don't have to do that. Nobody's going to call you out on it. So an easy shortcut for you if you're modeling vines is not to actually model that part. That said, you do want to make sure you know what a vine is. These hangy downy vines are really only found in bogs where there's stagnant water. I guess most people probably buy that as a rainforest element in this kind of rainforest. I've lived underneath these, so I feel like these aren't in the right spot. They kind of break immersion for me, but you know what? I can see them working fine for the vast majority of your players, so that works great. Fine, good. This, however, what's with this? Why is there a flying vine? Is this an elf bridge that for some reason got stuck here? I don't think vines do this. I've never seen vines do this, and it happens everywhere. This level is full of these weird, super straight flying vines. Bizarre. Maybe they do that somewhere. Let me know if they do. You can also see that they lighten up the green with just contrasting colors. Purple, blue, yellow, whatever they can find, and they do it with both flowers and mushrooms. So really these touches do make a lot of difference. You don't have to have big swaths of color because green doesn't really lock you down very hard. So you just need a touch here and there to break the player free. Most of the differentiation you're going to be using isn't to make the player feel like it's less green. It's going to be to make the player feel like they can navigate. That's going to be a bigger challenge if you're doing something like I like, where it's mostly you pushing through shoulder-high foliage. But even in a situation like this, you have to be careful to make sure that the player can see where the plants are and where the trees are and where they can go and where they can't go. So that's always going to be a challenge, much more than the exact color balance of your greens versus other colors. So I don't worry too much about that. I wouldn't. But I'm speaking kind of hypothetically here. I don't have any world-class rainforest levels under my belt. I'm just looking at what I've seen and what I have seen in both video games and real life. This bridge is wonderful. I like it. It's my favorite asset in the level. It is a fantastic bridge. I get the feeling that they must have gone out and found a bridge made like this, taken photographs, and then recreated it live here. This doesn't feel like a bridge someone invented. It feels like a bridge someone took whole cloth. And that's kind of amazing. I love it. If you know what this is based on, is there a specific bridge in Japan that looks like this? It's fantastic. I love it. So, let's talk about the actual layout of these levels. You have a lot of opportunities in a rainforest level that you don't have in other levels, and unfortunately, Dragon Quest XI doesn't take advantage of these opportunities. A rainforest is one of the very few places where nature is deep and dark and eternal. You can really, really give the player a strong feeling of the size of your world. You can give the feeling that you're lost in this incredibly huge jungle that doesn't really give a crap about you. And that's an amazing feeling that you have a very hard time using in any other biome. There really are very few biomes that can surround the player in as much age and density and life. And it's a shame when you don't use that. You can use that to give the player a feeling of that age, making them aware of how big your world is, how old your world is, that's a powerful tool, and it's a shame that it's not in use more here. For example, here you can see what we've got is an ancient temple, but the ancient temple is what feels old, not the jungle. And that's a darn shame. You really want to invert that. Not that the jungle should feel, not that the temple should feel new, but the jungle can give off a sense of unending eons. And that's something that's really tough to do in other biomes. So you should take advantage of that if you can. And another thing you can do is, people are used to thinking that in a rainforest or a jungle, there could be anything. Maybe you'll stumble across a city of gold, right? You can just throw whatever you want in there. And moreover, as long as there's like 5 or 10 feet of dense rainforest between two areas, you can just throw it in again. As long as you can't see both areas at the same time, it's not going to feel too dense. So you can have a lot of different stuff in a rainforest. And that means that you can explain anything you want. And it's a really good excuse for clearings. Why does this clearing exist? Well, it exists because somebody built a temple and they cleared the trees out. Great. That's a really good way to add density to your rainforest level. You can also do story beats with that and building your world with that. I now know that there is some kind of ancient civilization here. I doubt it ever comes up, but I know it exists. It might come up, now that I'm thinking about it, but certainly doesn't come up in this level. I love these tiles here are fantastic. I would have been tempted to use them for all of the pathwork, but I can see why they didn't, because they're very, very straight. Still, I love them. They look great. This clearing over here, it's a woodcutter's clearing. It's a clearing because a woodcutter cleared it. Great. So you can create this kind of density. Does there have to be any connection between the woodcutter here and the ancient ruins 100 feet that way? No. Because you can find anything in a rainforest. At least that's what we've been taught, so that's what we'll buy. That's hard to do in other kinds of settings. If you go around the corner of a mountain and you find a castle, and you go around the next corner of the mountain and you find a giant pit of demons, you're going to be like, why is this so close to the castle? You think the demons would round the corner and eat the humans at some point. But you don't really get that sense when you're in a rainforest. At least not if it's a dense rainforest. With this kind of incredibly sparse rainforest, I'm not sure you could sell it quite as well. Still, this is a very well done level for the constraints they had to operate in, and this is a wonderful view, for example. And if we look over here, you can see this really does feel like a rainforest, even though there's no canopy. It's a well done level with their constraints. You can choose different constraints. There's no particular limit on how you can build these levels. Just keep in mind that rainforests have a lot of potential that other biomes don't have. And if you can use that potential, you can make the rainforest levels shine rather than simply be pretty good. And that's all I have to say about rainforests. I hope that was all clear, and see you around.